With Mike Macdonald now at the helm as the new head coach, the Seahawks are hoping for a rapid turnaround on defense. What are we going to be looking for on that side of the ball when training camp opens on Wednesday? We're going to be breaking it all down in our latest edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on Training Camp Eve by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening down in Bend, Oregon, or in Fargo, North Dakota. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. As I just mentioned, it is Training Camp Eve. The Seahawks will be back on the practice field with their first open training camp practice at this time tomorrow. So we will get our first look at the 2024 Seattle Seahawks, at least from a training camp perspective. So we're going to be diving into the defensive side of the ball. We previewed offense yesterday. We're going to be talking about that new look defense with Mike Macdonald at the wheel, trying to put this thing together to make it a much better defense. Some key players that we're going to be watching in training camp, and the final three players, the most important players on our 90-man countdown as we put a bow on the offseason and get ready for 2024. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking all customers up with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Training camp is officially upon us. It'll start tomorrow for the Seattle Seahawks. And while there are extremely high expectations on the offensive side of the ball, the returning Seattle has a two-time Pro Bowl quarterback in Geno Smith. Defense is the more intriguing side of the ball, at least heading into training camp, because, Rob, we've got a defensive-minded coach in Mike Macdonald that has come to town to replace Pete Carroll. You've got a number of new coaches on this staff that have defensive backgrounds. And you've got a lot of personnel changes. There's certainly some players coming back from last year's squad, but a lot more changes on that side of the ball personnel-wise than what we saw on the offensive side of the football. And so that creates a lot more intrigue on this side of the ball that really is where the Seahawks have to improve the most if they want to get back to the playoffs.
Yeah, no question about it, Corbin. I mean, there were so many times this past season, especially where the run defense failed the Seahawks. And so the fact that there are massive improvements needed on the defensive side of the ball, that's just one reason why our focus has to be there. As you said, obviously a defensive-minded head coach in Mike Macdonald, and one whose success, especially with the Baltimore Ravens this past season, was absolutely remarkable. Led the NFL in sacks, led the NFL in turnovers, led the NFL in points against allowed. So just a sparkling resume that's coming to the Seahawks. And then, of course, you're replacing some legends in Bobby Wagner and Quandre Diggs, Jamal Adams, Jordan Brooks, in particular, those four players. And the Seahawks have some replacements for them, but are they going to be good enough? So just to start off right off the bat, that's where I want to kind of focus the attention. That's where I'm going to be watching most of all, is especially at the inside linebacker position, considering how much the Seahawks struggled on run defense a year ago. The fact that you are playing in a division that is as loaded in powerful running games as the NFC West is. And then again, the fact that you've brought in two linebackers. Look, I have a great deal of respect for Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dodson, but let's face it, these were not, big ticket free agent additions for the Seahawks. These are basically, at this point in their career, could be described almost as journeymen. And then behind that, of course, we got guys like John Radigan and Patrick O'Connell, who have never played, or at least not meaningful minutes in terms of the NFL regular season. So Corbin, as fascinating as I am about how Geno Smith and the offense is going to acclimate to Ryan Grubb's offense, to me, the conversation ends at the linebacker position. And can Mike Macdonald sprinkle some little magic dust on the Seahawks linebacker core and turn this back into the formidable defense that it needs to have if they want to be meaningful competitors in the NFL this year?
Yeah, they're not going to have Tyrell Dodson or Jerome Baker out there to start training camp. Remember, they were placed in the PUP list last week. They didn't do anything in the offseason program. If those guys miss an extended period of time to open training camp on top of that, you better hope Mike Macdonald does have that magic dust, that he's a wizard and he is able to figure out how he is going to put this makeshift linebacker group together. And especially when those veterans come back, they're going to be way behind the 8 ball. I don't care how much stuff you've been doing in the classroom. When you're learning a new defense, you got to be able to get out there on the field with your teammates. And they haven't been able to do that to that point. So the fact that you have no other guys in your roster away from those two that have started a single NFL game at linebacker, there's a reason this has been the most concerning position for fans. And I think when you look at media members as well, this is the position that jumps out on defense. What I'm excited to see, though, this is the side of the ball. Offense has got some really good young players too, but on defense, you have some real budding stars, particularly in the secondary. Devin and Rick Woolen. You got Boye Mafe up front in the trenches. You got Byron Murphy. I know he hasn't played it down in the NFL, but he is already being tabbed as that next stud that the Seahawks have drafted that's going to be an impact player immediately and has a chance to be a star. Getting to see what that next step is for players like Tariq Woolen, Devin Witherspoon, Boye Mafe. What do they have in store now playing in this defense that everyone is hoping is going to fully maximize all of their talents? Do we have a double-digit sack guy this year in Boye Mafe? Is Devin Witherspoon going to be getting the first of what could be many all-pros given his all-around Swiss Army skill set? Is Rick Woolen going to rediscover his rookie form and maybe even take it to another level there in his third season as a cornerback in the NFL? All those exciting young pieces. And you've got these incoming draft picks as well to go with them. Byron Murphy is going to be must-see TV out there at training camp. But seeing these returning youngsters that are in their second and third seasons and what Mike Macdonald and his new coaching staff can do to just further elevate their game as foundational young superstars potentially, that is the really fun part of getting to watch this defense starting in training camp.
Yeah, no question about it. That is the most enjoyable part of it. As you said, you mentioned a bunch of the players by name that I think that we're all most intrigued by. I mean, just what a marvel that Devin Witherspoon was this past season. And if he is able to build upon that, if we can just see a little bit more of the return to the ball hawk that was Rick Woolen 2 years ago, and then, of course, dropped off this past season, and add a little bit more consistency to Boye Mafe's game. If you get those three players playing at the level that it seems so possible for them to achieve, then the Seahawks almost by default are going to be a much improved defense. And again, I don't know that any one of those three players necessarily is going to be making a huge impact in the run defense. And so again, that's where I really feel like there has to be a shift in the focus of who is going to be the superstars. If this is a defense that is truly built just around the passing defense, then the run defense is going to be squandered as a result of that. So what I want to see is some of the lesser known defensive players on this squad really start to ascend. Maybe a Derek Hall, maybe a Mike Morris, for example, rather than it being the veterans like a Jaron Reed or Leonard Williams that have, shown with toughness and savvy and kind of held this defense together over the last couple of years. It's time for young players like those superstars to really step up their game, and then also have some of the other players that maybe aren't getting quite as much buzz as a Witherspoon, for example, to truly take their game to the next level. Should it be a linebacker like a John Radigan again, or a Patrick O'Connell, or maybe even the rookie Tyrese Knight? Somebody that we're not talking about yet, Corbin, really has to take a similar ascension as the players that we talked about just a moment ago.
And I think the last thing, and you and I were talking about this before the show, this is maybe one of the bigger question marks away from linebacker. There is some talent at safety. Julian Love made the Pro Bowl last year. We saw the way he played down the stretch. Rayshon Jenkins has been an underrated player for a long time, going back to when he was with the Chargers. I have always loved his game. Not a superstar, but a really solid safety. But how is he going to fit in this defense? Where does Kayvon Wallace fit in? Is Kobe Bryant part of this equation at safety? This is truly a case where the Seahawks are hoping less is more. You moved on from Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams with those huge contracts, and you signed much cheaper players that have a lot of experience in the NFL. Jenkins and Wallace, those guys have played a lot of snaps in the league, and you're hoping you can get just as good a production, if not better, at a much cheaper price point. That's the hope. We just don't know if that's necessarily how this is going to play out. And so we're going to get that first real opportunity to see how things start to shake out, how things mesh with this new safety group. And maybe Jarek Reed II eventually gets back into this coming off an ACL tear. But there's a lot of bodies, not necessarily an idea how everything's going to play out, though, especially with the 3 safety looks that Macdonald likes to play. And so that really that's kind of that mid-ground here. We're excited about the young stars, worried about linebackers. Safety's kind of in the middle there. Could be really solid. This could be an area that could also be trouble, too.
It could be, but I love the fact that when you mentioned the last thing that we're basically focusing in on here, that you mentioned the safety position. Julian Love being voted here, I believe it was number 95 overall in a recent polling, the NFL.com's ranking of all veteran players in all the NFL. So that is obviously comforting. And then the fact that you mentioned Rayshawn Jenkins, I mean, to me, he is exactly the type of player that is exactly who I was, kind of describing just a moment ago, Corbin. One of these players is kind of lying in the weeds that may wind up becoming an absolute star in this defense. Not many people out there across the NFL landscape had heard of Geno Stone prior to his incredible breakout performance leading the NFL in interceptions this past season for Mike Macdonald's defense. Rayshawn Jenkins, Julian Love, Kobe Bryant might be one of those players who is able to take advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun to see how that safety group plays out. And really, that is linebacker. There's concerns because who's missing. This is just a position group where, like, you're expecting almost everybody's going to be out there. There's just some uncertainty how everything is going to come together there. And that always is interesting to watch at training camp. When we come back, we're going to take a more micro-oriented look at the players that we're going to be watching on the defensive side of the ball when training camp opens. Who is under the radar on the defensive side of the football? We'll get to that up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates as possible to interview. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals to add to your team faster and for free. As a site manager, LinkedIn Jobs is my go-to to post writing positions and land top candidates. They've made the process easy and seamless. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. There's more than 1 billion professionals on the network, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring so easy that you can have 86% of small businesses with a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. Thankfully, with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, it's quick, it's easy. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined here on Training Camp Eve by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate the support. It's part 2 of our training camp preview. Open practice number 1 coming up at this time tomorrow. So we are 1 day away from the madness beginning and ushering in the 2024 season for the Seattle Seahawks. And we're putting the microscope on Mike Macdonald's defense on today's show. We just looked at some of the big picture items as far as storylines or what we're going to be watching closely at camp. Now let's take things a little bit deeper into the woods here. Individual players that we are going to be zeroing in on. And Rob, I know there is one player that fans are going to be watching very closely because this will be the first time they've seen him at training camp. You and I have had the chance to see him in OTAs, but Byron Murphy's got to be at the top of this list for anybody that's watching training camp, right?
Yeah, I think he probably has to be. He's number 1 on my list. He's just one of those guys. I've mentioned this before. I'm very fortunate, and I get an opportunity to see an awful lot of very talented athletes, and it would be football or other sports. There's only so many players that I would be willing to pay money just to see them practice. And I think that Byron Murphy II may be one of those types of players. Certainly Aaron Donald was one of those types of players. And of course, Aaron Donald is a player that a lot of people people have compared Byron Murphy II too. Just his blend of explosiveness, power, quickness. He really could be that penetrating, just dominant factor along the line of scrimmage. The Seahawks, frankly, have been lacking for an awful long time, at least in terms of interior defensive linemen. And so super intrigued to see what he is able to do. And not only what he is able to do in terms of a micro component, but what he is able to provide the Seahawks that might be able to create a lot more of secondary pass rush. One of the reasons we were so excited about Macdonald signing with the Seahawks in the first place is because the Baltimore Ravens didn't have superstars along the defensive line or at the outside linebacker position. Macdonald's defense made them into superstars, and they did so in waves. And so, again, with Byron Murphy the second, I think that he is a player who is going to create such havoc that several other players along the defensive line, outside linebacker, are going to be able to create sacks that his pressures created for them.
Yeah, and I think one player that could potentially benefit from Byron Murphy II's presence, a player that really could benefit here, is somebody like a Derek Hall, who is going to get his chances to show what he can do in a secondary role off the edge. Last year didn't have any sacks. He was a really productive pass rusher in the SEC at Auburn. You want to see that start to translate. But if you have more disruptive players in the interior, it does open things up. It creates a lot of ideal one-on-ones for your edge rushers. So maybe somebody like Derek Hall could certainly fit the bill. As far as players that I'm going to be watching, Byron Murphy, I could have had him on my list, but I'm going to go with the first rounder from last year. We just talked about him a little bit, Devin Witherspoon. Just the leadership presence that he is already developing into. We got to see that firsthand at OTAs. We got to see it at mini camp, and just the respect that he commands from the older players on this football team. Seattle needs some alpha dogs to emerge here. That, to me, has been one of the biggest issues for this team. They've had some really good players the last 4 or 5 years, but ever since the Legion of Boom, you haven't had those lead dogs that have really risen up and taken on a leadership role, and also were the stars. They brought the star Devin Witherspoon, both those boxes. And, oh, by the way, he's another one of those players I would pay to watch practice, because he is really fun and intense to watch out there on the practice field. And I want to go to the defensive line for the next player that I'm looking at. And he was drafted in the 5th round last year. Mike Morris missed almost the entire season with a shoulder injury. But you want to talk about a versatile chess piece. He's played big end. He played some 3-tech, and I thought he had a really good training camp last year until that shoulder started acting up on him, and then he ended up missing most of the season. But this is a kid that already has played for Mike Macdonald at Michigan for a year, already has that built-in chemistry with the new head coach, and that versatility, just a different body type too. This guy is one of those where you just kind of, your eyes gravitate like, who is that really tall, big dude over there with the defensive line? Mike Morris has kind of been an afterthought because of all the additions on the defensive line, including Murphy, Jonathan Hankins coming in. But I could see Mike Morris being one of those guys that says, hey, not so fast. Don't forget about me. I can be a big part of this defensive line too. And if that happens, the rich get richer, which I think is very possible for the Seahawks up front.
Yeah, I love the fact that you just mentioned Mike Morris. I mean, to me, he is a very intriguing player. Just his size and stature, as you said. I mean, it just kind of almost makes him somebody that you have to kind of keep an eye on. And then you also mentioned Derek Hall. And to me, that's the conversation you got to have is, again, who are these second-year players that are going to make that next step for the Seahawks? And Derek Hall, when we were talking before about the top focus. For me, the top focus remains the run defense. But if we're talking about individual players, then one of the more entertaining elements of this process for me is watching pass rushers. And so Derek Hall is the pass rusher that I'm most intrigued by, to see what he is able to provide in year 2. And I'm a big fan of what I've seen so far in this offseason from Draymond Jones. I feel like I deserve some credit for whatever success that Darrell Taylor ever has in Seattle, because I don't know there's many people who have kind of stood up for him as much as I have over time. So I want to see if he is able to actually turn that into the breakout season that I really think that his speed and his slitheriness off the edge really should make him a dominant passer pass rusher. But still, the player that I am most intrigued by that entire group, Corbin, remains Derek Hall. The Seahawks made a huge investment in him. And so the fact is, we saw a lot of quality run defense a year ago. I want to see him be able to turn that into more pass rush success this year. And then you mentioned, of course, our favorite player to watch out there is Devin Witherspoon. What about the corner on the other side? Can Riq Woolen really become the superstar again that his talent suggests that he can? Because if he does not clean up the run defense, then I really think that Mike Macdonald has the courage, frankly, to put Riq Woolen back on the bench. Pete Carroll did it for a game a year ago. We saw some improvement from Riq Woolen. I think they could be a statement from the very get-go that Riq Woolen has got to be better. And so to me, he is definitely one of the players I'm looking to evaluate throughout this entire training camp and preseason game process.
From that draft class a couple years ago, I want to take a look at the other end of the spectrum, because Riq Woolen, I'm anticipating, is going to start. Devin Witherspoon is going to start. We've talked about this throughout the offseason. Kobe Bryant, and maybe I have a little different tune now than I did, say, a month and a half ago, when we've now gotten to see OTAs, we've gotten to see minicamp. I still don't know where Kobe Bryant fits into this equation. And yet at the same time, I don't know that there's a player in that safety group now that I am more fascinated by, because I do think that there are the prerequisite skills there for him to be that multiple safety that can play both positions, because we've seen him play in the box. We've seen him blitz, and he's been effective doing that. We've seen the Peanut Tillman-like ball stripping skills this kid has. There are a lot of traits that I feel like you can put at the safety position he can excel with. And I also think the fact he doesn't have great straight line speed, I think you can disguise that a little bit more at the safety position than you can at outside, and certainly in the slot at cornerback. But the fact he has played slot cornerback, it gives him more snaps in the field in different sub packages. He was playing with a second team defense in OTAs. I just want to see if Kobe Bryant can make a push, because I'm really curious to see if he says, hey, you newcomers, I'm in a new position. This is actually the second year that I've had to look at safety, but I'm now all safety all the time here. I'm ready to compete for snaps. And this is a guy 2 years ago that had a really solid rookie year. So can he get himself back on that long-term track with the Seahawks, where he is a piece of the puzzle that they're wanting to keep around and they want to get him snaps for? And you mentioned Draymond Jones. That's the last name I'm throwing out there, just because I continue to be really excited about seeing what he's going to do in this scheme playing off the edge. It's not the same defense as what we saw a year ago. There's some similarities, but Seattle's new defensive scheme under Mike Macdonald, what they're going to be able to do with Draymond Jones, that to me is one of the bigger storylines from an individual player. If you can get him getting to 6 or 7 sacks and his presence off the edge helps your run defense and just the rotation overall, that is a big win, and it makes him more worth the money that you paid him a couple years ago. So these are all players that I think make a ton of sense to really zero in for vastly different reasons on.
Yeah, and the same thing with the last two players that I'm going to mention, Rayshawn Jenkins, for very similar reasons as what you were talking about before with Kobe Bryant. I think Rayshawn Jenkins is just a cleaner open field tackler than Seattle has had at the safety position for a while now. And I don't mean any disrespect to the previous safeties, but there were times where it felt like, whether it be Diggs, whether it be Jamal Adams, that they were willing to kind of lower that shoulder and instead of wrapping up securely. And I do think that you are going to see some more reliable tackling from Rayshawn Jenkins, as well as improved ball skills, better in coverage, certainly than Jamal Adams was. I don't know if there's anybody who's better at covering the post than what Quandre Diggs has been. And then finally, in terms of, speaking of tackling, John Radigan, to me, is a player that I'm excited to see. I think that, to me, he just, obviously the Army mindset and all those things, that's fascinating. I talk about, I'm more interested in about who you are as a football player. And I think that his size, his physicality, his mentality, to me, screams classic run defending inside linebacker, one of those tough guys, one of those dogs, as you said before. I think that he's got that in him. And the longer that Jerome Baker and especially Tyrell Dodson, especially Tyrese Knight, the longer that they are not getting those first team reps, of course, that means that John Radigan is. And I think that he is the type of player that is going to develop some fans in that linebacker coaching staff and Macdonald specifically quickly as well. And I think that is going to perhaps make John Radigan one of those players who, again, is going to be a guy who's kind of laying in the weeds that winds up becoming one of the truly impactful players for the Seahawks defense in 2024.
When we come back, we are to the final three in our 90-man countdown, the three most important players for the Seahawks heading into the 2024 season. We'll reveal those final three coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. The playoffs are done in NBA and NHL. There's fewer games out there. The sports aren't sportsing the way that I want them to, but FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 win or lose. Who will lead the U.S. men's basketball team in scoring in the Olympics? Does Byron Murphy II have a strong shot at winning Defensive Rookie of the Year for the Seahawks? Can Aaron Judge get to 60 home runs again for the Yankees? You can bet on it all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, training camp eve edition here. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined as always by my co-host in crime, Rob Brang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. Thank you as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. As we do every year, we break down every single player on Seattle's 90-man roster. It usually ends up being more than 90 players, and this year was no different because there's some moves that happened during the middle of the offseason, some end of the roster churning, but we have finally made it to the end, to the finish line here with training camp starting tomorrow. The three most important players for the Seattle Seahawks heading into the 2024 season. And we're going to stick with defense here for our first player coming in at number 3. And last year he was number 6 on our top 100. And then we saw what happened when Uchenna Nwosu got injured for the Seahawks and just how much that run defense dropped off. And I know there were other factors. Some of you that listen to the show, we have seen the comments. Hey, one player doesn't make all this happen. That's true. But at the same time, there's no denying that this defense they badly missed Uchenna Nwosu last year, and getting him back healthy this year, a guy that can defend the run, can rush the passer, and I think has all the skills to be really successful as an edge in this Mike Macdonald defensive scheme. There's no doubt in my mind that Uchenna Nwosu is one of the most important players for the Seattle Seahawks going into the season. And in fact, we've got him ranked as the number 1 most important defender for the Seahawks heading into this year.
Yeah, and I think that for people who don't follow the Seahawks that closely, that they might quibble with our selection here of Nwosu this high. But as you referenced, Corbin, the drop-off in run defense in particular a year ago was just so stark when Uchenna Nwosu went down. I mean, the Seahawks were a solid run defense, top 10 in the NFL. And then when Uchenna Nwosu went down, they were, in the final 2 or 3 spots in all of the league. I mean, at the times they were horrifically bad, and so the big thing here is that Uchenna Nwosu is a compact frame. He's very powerful. He is very tough. He's very aggressive, and some of the things that he does very, very well, especially in run defense, are the exact opposite of something that, say, a Darrell Taylor provides. So when you have a healthy, say, Nwosu and Boye Mafe and Darrell Taylor and Derek Hall, then it all works out beautifully because they kind of complement each other and what their specific strengths and weaknesses. But when you lose a player like Nwosu, in my opinion, is the toughest, nastiest, meanest, kind of a player that the Seahawks have on defense, the most intimidating, the biggest of the junkyard dogs on that squad. When you lose the toughest player, then I think you have teammates kind of looking at each other like, well, what do we do now? Our toughest, nastiest player, most intimidating player is no longer on the roster or no longer, playing. And so, again, it was such a drop off. And so it's not that I necessarily think that Nwosu is going to lead the squad in sacks this upcoming season. It's not that I necessarily expect him to lead the squad in forced fumbles or tackles or any of those things. But his value to the club is so much bigger than his individual statistics. So, yeah, I 100% agree with his placement here. And I think that if he doesn't return to the form storm that the Seahawks fortunately saw the last couple of years, then I think that Seattle is going to find that this is a regular season that ends at the end of the regular season instead of going into the playoffs. Nwosu, to me, is that important.
Coming in at number 2, this player has had one of the best 5-year starts for a receiver in NFL history. DK Metcalf, 3,000-yard seasons the last 5 years, scored 8 touchdowns last season, 16.9 yards per reception, a career high. Didn't have as many catches, but he made them count. We got to see the big plays like the 75-yard touchdown against the Cowboys as just one example. And we've seen those flashes, and it's crazy that we continue to mention this. Metcalf is easily a top 15, top 20 receiver in the NFL, but we have not seen the consistency or that real jump from being a really good receiver to an elite receiver. That is the thing that is yet to happen with Metcalf. And for this Seahawks offense to really reach its full potential, we've talked the offensive line. That's obviously going to be number 1. But number 2, can DK Metcalf truly become that alpha dog, especially with all the other stud receivers Seattle's got around? Maybe he doesn't show up completely in the stats, but can you get better consistency in terms of catch rate being higher? Is he going to be able to win more of those contested opportunities that you and I would agree? I think that he has missed on too many of those for a player of his size in his 5-year career. As good as he is, it still feels like there's still something to gain there with DK Metcalf, and you're hoping Ryan Grubb is the chef that can put together that perfect recipe to get his full potential cooked up this year.
Yeah, we had Jackson Bevins on, and he used an expression that I thought just perfectly describes DK Metcalf, and just said that it feels like there's so much more meat still on the bone. And I think, again, that just describes Metcalf, that you're talking about a player who is so physically gifted, and yet some of the areas in which he is, very, very talented, like in his leaping ability, like his size and his strength. You just nailed it on the head there, Corbin, when you mentioned the fact that he has not been as successful, in the red zone in particular, in those contested throws, as you might expect for a player of his size and stature. So can he take that next step? There's no doubt in my mind that he is the Seahawks' most physically dominant player. He is the one that is going to cause opposing coaches and fan bases to, struggle with sleeping the night before, kind of a thing, before they play them. But at the same time, has he demonstrated himself to be one of those top 10, top 15 wide receivers in the NFL? I think that he can be that guy. I think that it's incumbent on him to improve in terms of the timing, as we talked about, on jump balls. And he has shown improvement as a route runner throughout his career. That's one thing I've been very, very impressed by him. I also think that's incumbent on Ryan Grubb and Geno Smith to continue to, just to force feed essentially the ball to DK Metcalf's hands, because I really do think that he is the best player on this squad. Obviously, the quarterback, Geno Smith, is the most, valuable, but in just because of the position. But in terms of brilliance, in terms of who could be somebody that you see someday wearing a gold jacket, DK Metcalf is the guy for the Seahawks.
At the end of the day, though, as you mentioned, quarterback, it's the position. It's the most important spot. Sure. And for the Seahawks to realize what they believe this offense can be, for that to come to reality, for this to be a top 5 offense, I thought Geno Smith played pretty darn well last year, considering the fact he had some injuries. The offensive line, we have mentioned over and over again, the injuries, the inconsistency from that group. And so, circumstances were not great for Geno Smith. He made the most of that situation, but the buck stops with the quarterback. If you want to get into the playoffs again and you want to be able to win postseason games, you need your quarterback to be able to elevate everybody around him. I feel like sometimes I'm in the minority saying this, but I think Geno Smith has the talent to be able to do that. I believe that he can elevate the players. And I think last year there's some pretty good evidence that he can do that in game. I mean, all the game-winning drives that he orchestrated. I mean, this guy has shown that he's capable of picking a team up on his throwing arm and lifting that team to victory. He needs more help. But at the same time, if you want to get to the playoffs and win playoff games, again, the buck stops with the quarterback. So no surprise, Geno Smith coming in at number 1 here in our countdown as far as most important Seahawks for 2024. If they want to make noise, the defense has got to be better. You're hoping your O-line is better. End of the day, though, number 7, it is on you. The onus is on you. how much more can you carry this team in your third year as the starter?
Yeah, and I think that's well said. Number 7 is number 1 in terms of who is most important to the squad, and just the improvement that Geno Smith has shown. It's exactly the type of commitment that frankly I'd like to see DK Metcalf show. And again, I'm not trying to knock DK Metcalf, but I think that Geno Smith, again, justifiably is our number 1 player here just because of the value of the quarterback position that goes without saying. But the leadership, the clutch factor, how many times that he basically took snaps and was running for his life before the ball even got to him, dipped under or ducked under, and then threw an absolute strike. I mean, there were so many throws that Geno Smith made that if he was in New York, if he was in Dallas, if he was in anywhere with a bigger media market, then people would be talking about him as an MVP candidate. There's just so many plays that Geno Smith basically, made something out of nothing. And so with a little bit more pass protection around him, a little bit more reliable hands around him, I really think that Geno Smith could be on the cusp of his greatest statistical season of his NFL career. And obviously that bodes very well for the Seahawks and their playoff potential.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow is maybe the most exciting episode of the entire year. We will have our observations from day 1 of Seahawks training camp. We'll be dishing those out from the VMAC. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your training camp eve. Go Hawks.